After the Macedonian army set out in the spring of 334 BC and marched along the northern coast of the Aegean, Alexander the Great reached Sestus after 20 days. From there he planned the transition to Asia Minor via the Hellespont. Since the Persian fleet had failed to block the strait, Alexander was able to position his fleet, consisting of 160 triremes and numerous cargo ships, there. While the Macedonian general Parmenion brought most of the army to Abydos, Alexander landed with a small force opposite Troy. Symbolically, he threw his lance ashore, spear acquired, and made sacrifices to the heroes of the Trojan War, especially his role model Achilles, by exchanging his shield for the hero's shield in the hero's sanctuary. He ordered the reconstruction of Troy and granted the new citizens autonomy and tax exemption. In keeping with the thinking and self-image of the ancient world, Alexander attached great importance to religious ceremonies and cultic practices. His honoring of the gods of other peoples and the offering of sacrifices to them was unusual for his time. Within this framework, Alexander's explanation for his campaign as retaliation for the destruction of Greek cities, particularly the Acropolis in Athens in 480 BC, can also be interpreted by the Persian king Xerxes I. In fact, political and economic interests also played an important role back then. At Abydos, Alexander united his main forces again and then quickly marched against the already deployed army of the Persian satraps of Asia Minor. In preparation for this encounter, Greek King Darius III made a serious mistake by not appointing a clear commander-in-chief, but instead leaving the procedure to a war council of his satraps. At this council of war, the Greek mercenary leader Memnon of Rhodes had proposed a defensive strategy to lure the Macedonians into the country and then create difficulties with supplies through scorched earth tactics. However, Memnon was unable to assert himself against the satraps because the Persian nobles saw him as a favor from the great king and also did not want to destroy their lands, which would not befit their honor. Therefore, the Persian army marched to meet Alexander and positioned itself on the eastern bank of the Granicus River. The Granicus River, now known as Biga, was about 20 meters wide at the battle site and flows into the Sea of Marmara. In their desire to strike the invaders as soon as they crossed, the Persian cavalry positioned themselves directly on the river, while the Greek mercenaries were positioned backwards on the rising ground. Alexander immediately recognized the unfavorable positioning of the Persians. The cavalry was an offensive weapon and was not suitable for defending foot troops, especially not against the Macedonian phalangites with their excessively long spears. Even the advice of his general Parmenion, who recommended waiting, did not stop him from doing so because he feared that his opponents would realize their mistake. He positioned the light cavalry together with the heavily armed foot troops on the left and right wings of the enemy army, so that the Persian horsemen were divided into the various focal points. Alexander personally attacked the densest concentration of opponents and the military leaders gathered there with his cavalry, the agema of knighthood. His white helmet bush could be seen in the thick of the crowd, and he narrowly escaped death, finally being saved by his companion Clytos. The Macedonians retained the upper hand and broke through the Persian center. The distant Persian infantry, and especially the Greek mercenaries, were condemned to watch the events. Now they were attacked concentrically from all sides, and only a few escaped, while 2,000 were captured. Only the Thebans were released. The battle took place in early May. Alexander also had the fallen enemies buried and personally asked the wounded about their health and the circumstances of their injuries. The captured mercenaries were taken to Macedonia for forced labor in order to deter Greeks from entering Persian service. After the Battle of Issus, they were given amnesty. The sculptor Lysippos created a group of 34 bronze equestrian statues depicting Alexander along with the generals who died in battle. The statues were erected in the city of Dion and later placed in the Porticus of Octavia in Rome. The victory had broken Persia's power in Asia Minor. Although Memnon had escaped with some of the mercenaries and tried to rely on the Persian garrisons in the Ionian cities, he was only able to establish himself again in Halicarnassus, where he received supreme command of the theater of war in Asia Minor from the great king. Alexander avoided penetrating the interior, even though this would have promised rich booty. In order to deny the superior Persian fleet effective operations, he had to occupy the coastal cities. An exception was Sardis, the satrap residence and former capital of Lydia. The conquest in the interior of the country was necessary to secure the flank of his further ventures. The feared resistance did not materialize, and the commander Mithraeus surrendered the city and castle. Alexander took the Persian into his entourage, while the inhabitants of Sardis and Lydia regained their freedom and their old constitution. Alexander directed his main force towards Ionia, where the cities, provided they were not under Persian occupation or oligarchic rule, willingly opened their gates. His route led through major cities such as Ephesus and Miletus, as well as other important cities such as Magnesia, Trallius, Smyrna, Priene and Clazomenae, to the cities in Curia with the capital Halicarnassus, and on to Perge and Aspendos on the south coast, before he left with his army returned inland to Gordion to overwinter there. At the end of 334 BC, the coastal regions of Asia Minor were largely in the hands of the Macedonians. However, Memnon still controlled the fleet and began to cut off Alexander's connection to Macedonia, with the aim of taking the war to Greece. There was still no cause for concern on the Persian side. The following year, 333 BC, would bring a decision.